You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield here. For those who are listening on Spotify and Apple, this will be a great way for us to test who's in which audience, Scott.
Yeah, this is a good A/B testing. For top get a decline test, or funny or not. Yes.
Right. We had a little bit of a recording mishap on the video side, so you all are just joining us, but the audio only audience got some extra stuff.
We're trying to juice our Spotify first 2-minute numbers, so you can get everybody back to listen just the first 2 minutes.
That's right. That's the algorithm speaking right there. That's amazing. Anyway, Scott and I are back, and Scott had a whole thing about cognitive decline, which then I demonstrated as a proof of concept in that first 3 minutes of the show. So great start to things. It's the 16th of February. It snowed in Bloomington. Did it snow?
It did.
Up in wine country up there.
Yes, up in wine country. The grapes are they're in rough shape. I did have a new bourbon last night. That's what we were doing last night. Bourbon on the rocks. It was nice.
Was this your first time with bourbon on the rocks?
No. I had a nice big ice cube. I'm just setting the stage, my friend, for everyone. No, we had about 2 inches of snow last night.
Yeah.
So, or over 3 a.m. because it happened way after I went to bed. But yeah, I'm not expecting snow this morning.
Are your hunting dogs excited about the snow?
Yes. Chester and Rufus are very excited about. I think of
Mortimer.
Yeah, Mortimer.
Beauregard. Yes.
You gotta give me a heads up. Hey, I need some fun hunting dog names. Give me a 2-minute lead up.
They're your hunting dogs. You should know what their names are. Come on. Anyway.
So many.
We're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and a never-ending array of amazing pieces coming out of Homefield Apparel. They had some new Creighton stuff that they dropped earlier this week. They've obviously had some really good-looking stuff on the IU front coming out relatively recently. Go to the website. You'll find pretty much everything. The Rinkside hoodies. They have a new St. John's collection. St. John's, good team to follow. Might be a nice bandwagon team to jump on for the tournament this year. They've got quarter zips. They've got T-shirts. They've got bomber jackets. Just a little bit of everything.
I blame Homefield for the weather. It's I think this is the weather saying it's still hockey jersey season. It's not time to be done yet.
It is possible that Connor and the folks up at Homefield have a
geostorm. Yeah.
Do you cloud seed for snow?
Yes, I think so.
You'd have to, right? Yeah.
You gotta watch the movie Geostorm.
No.
It's a great bad movie. It was on Why Did This Get Made? It's great. Or How Did This Get Made? Yeah. Anyway,
use the code HOME23 if you would like to go along with Homefield's plan for climate domination. And, they got you covered. If it's cold outside, they got you covered. When it gets hot, they've got some great, three-quarter sleeve T-shirts, baseball T-shirts. It's great. Again, homefieldapparel.com. Also give them a follow on the socials, and you'll find amazing deals sent right to you via email as well if you sign up for the newsletter. Again, homefieldapparel.com. Also, we are on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. We've had a lot of folks signing up for the free newsletter recently, which we greatly appreciate. And we would like to invite the rest of you who haven't to go ahead and subscribe. Scott, do you know what today is, actually? You know what this particular episode is?
Is this episode 2000? I know we're coming close to it.
No, episode 1200.
1200, all right.
We got a ways to go for 2000.
Hey, I'm cognitive decline. It's hitting.
Yeah.
More tests.
But it is episode 1200, okay. And obviously we're thrilled about that. And I think also just generally thrilled that we've got so many people in our Substack community. It allows us occasionally to do chats and to send podcasts right to your inbox. We occasionally have some VIP videos, which our paid subscribers get. We don't do them every day, but we do some things there occasionally. It's $5 a month, $50 a year if you'd like to do that. But if you just want to do the free one, that's fine too. And we appreciate having you folks joining us. Join the nearly 1,200 subscribers. We only almost have one subscriber for every episode that we've done.
I like
So
that. Give every subscriber gets an episode.
it's exciting. Looking forward to it. So we'll be.
That'll be when we're in month 5 of the coaching search. That'll be one of our. We just go through the subscriber list. All right, Mark, you're getting episode 1124. Just start handing them out.
So anyway, crimsoncast.substack.com. Also check out the Back Home Network YouTube channel. Just search Back Home Network on YouTube. We've got over 7,100 subscribers there. And you get all of the shows in video format, including Assembly Call, the Doing the Work podcast, all the shows in the network. It's a great place to be. Anyway, let's dive in. Let's talk briefly about the game that happened on Friday, Indiana losing at home to UCLA. And, Scott, this was one of those games that looked like most of the other games that Indiana's played in the Big Ten so far this season. They fall behind early, and it was just one of those games where, like, Indiana always felt about 10 points away from the team that was leading them, in this case, UCLA. And it kind of went back and forth. There were moments when, at one point Indiana got it to 5, and then it was back up to 10, and then it'd be back down to 7, and then it was back up to 10. UCLA didn't really put it away. Indiana puts a rush on at the end, gets it to within 2, has an inbounds play under their own basket, which was actually designed fairly well. They get a good shot, they miss it, and that was basically the ball game. I mean, we kind of knew how this was going to go. This played out very similar. You hoped maybe UCLA's road struggles in the Eastern and Central time zone might come back to bite them in this one, but as it turned out, Indiana just couldn't quite get the job done. Did you take anything noteworthy out of this game that you hadn't already seen in a previous game?
No. Well, no. I mean, the only noteworthy thing is it seems to be the Miles Rice. The ball seems to find him at the end of games like a magnet finds a refrigerator. Like, it's wild how it goes to him. You did mention, for all the crap we've given Woodson about end of game stuff, that final play from Mackenzie Mbaka was a great, well designed play. He did everything you could, and he didn't hit a shot. It's like, guys miss shots. It is what it is. It sucks that he also had the little, putbacker before that didn't go in. But, I'm not, my thought was this, I don't want to get into a discussion about this, but it is kind of, we had talks about, apathy and like, is apathy, no one showing up at the game. To me, it's like, this is kind of what apathy is, talking to other fans, myself, it's kind of like, I watched the game. It's like, all right, well, we lost. Like, all right, moving on. It's like, I wasn't expecting a win. A loss sucks, but it's like I shook it off real quick because we're kind of in this weird zone of like nothing really matters until we get a new coach, because we're probably not going to make the tournament unless we had just rattled off. Like if we win 3 or 4, if we had won this and then, beat Purdue and then beat Penn State. So it's like, maybe something's going on. But it felt like that Michigan State win is going to be the one that we look back on in 7 years. Like we look back at that stretch when Archie had like 8 losses and there's like he went 8 for 9 and there's the one win in the middle. I think that was also Michigan State, oddly. But anyway, that's my main thought. Is I don't want to get into a big apathy discussion, but I do think for a lot of fans listening to like the assembly call afterwards, it's kind of like we all expected a loss and we're kind of like, all right, well, whatever, which isn't great, but it's kind of where we're going to be for the next 4 weeks.
I think about 2 weeks ago, it was after that game at Purdue. We talked about like, okay, was that the beginning of something or was that the end of it all? I heard someone refer to that Purdue game as the death rattle. You play well, like you show some life, and then you don't actually end up winning the game at the end. The Michigan State game kind of, are you familiar with the concept of the dead cat bounce?
Yeah.
In stocks where a declining stock like hits a point where it's low enough that there's some capitalization, the price goes up, and then it just sinks again because it's not actually a recovery. It's just a thing that is a brief resurgence. They often call it a sucker's rally in stock trading, and that's essentially what I felt like that Michigan State game was. Like and it's one of those things where I know it sounds like I'm trying to take away from IU, but realistically, like they played well there. The problem is that it's just not sustainable for IU. That game, Indiana had a remarkable ability to score effectively, against Michigan State compared to what they would normally do. And defensively, they really stymied Michigan State in a way that was surprising given the fact that Michigan State, and look what they did last night. They went in and beat Illinois at Illinois. Sometimes you play well enough to win and the opponent does not play well enough to win, which I think we've been saying on this podcast for a month now, Scott.
The Michigan State thing, I looked at it. 2019, Archie lost 12 of 13 games and won a game at Michigan State in the middle there. And it's like, you look back and you're not like, oh man, I think they were really close to turning the corner after that Michigan State game. It's just, it historically looks like, oh, that's a weird outlier.
Who would have ever thought that East Lansing would be the place where we would like get the dead cat bounces for these bad seasons that Indiana's had? It's why it'd be like if it was happening in Mackey, except with victories. And obviously, I mean, Indiana has one win there in the last few years, but it is kind of peculiar given how much of a house of horrors that place has been. Of course, we still can't win in Madison, but at least
that's the bridge too far.
We kind of own East Lansing now, which is nice.
Madison's just a dead cat.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, they lose to UCLA, and I think the biggest thing that stands out to me, and again, you're almost at a point where you can't really interrogate the season any more than you have, and that's the thing I think that stuck out to me the most about UCLA is it's just the same team. Yeah. It's a team that's got talent. It's a team that clearly, in many moments in key spots in the game, doesn't really know what it's doing, and you've got one or two players out there that seem to know what they're doing, and then there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of yelling in the huddle. There's a lot of pointing and people getting upset with each other. It just seems like a team that's not well organized and not executing what's being said, which calls into question both the execution and the people that are asking them to do the executing. And again, all you have to do, I think, if you look at the raw efficiency numbers for IU, the last time they held an opponent to under a point per possession was the USC game, which was on the 8th of January.
Maybe it's us.
Yeah, perhaps. So we need to go back together and
Crimson Cast is in the house,
right? We need box seats for this. But no, you brought up another good point, which we'll wrap this particular part of the podcast on, which is the apathy is there in force. Like the number of people I talked to who didn't even watch the game. Who were like, oh, we lost again last night. I mean, the hall was in fairly good shape, but you could tell even at the end of the game, like it was not its full-throated self. There's just, on the one hand, it's like announcing that Woodson was not going to be returning was, I think, very helpful in terms of turning down the top-level heat on Woodson. That was important, and the players as well. But what it's done is it's kind of neutered the hall a bit in terms of what it normally does. And I don't know why anybody would be surprised by that. I'm sure the Purdue game, it'll be back to somewhat of its normal self, but it really does feel like everybody's just playing the string out, players, coaches, and fans across the board. So it
could have been, I agree with all of that. Like it's what needed to be done. Had they won that game, like I said, if they won that game and then they won the Purdue game, it would have been even a more peculiar situation. Cause then it's like, holy crap. Like this, they finally figured it out, and I guess that could still happen. If they but the thing is, if they beat Penn State and they beat Washington and they beat Oregon, they could get a little 3-game winning streak there. I would urge people to be like, again, I'm not sure they figured it out. It could just be the level of opponents that they're playing. The good news is looking at the projections for Big Ten standings, Penn State, Washington, and Northwestern just look locked into under 7 wins. And, Indiana should get one more. And even if they don't, they might still finish ahead of Northwestern, Washington, Penn State. Like, I think, and I say this not jokingly, I think them making the Big Ten tournament is safe. So that joke can be off the table. And that'll be the sole tournament they make this year.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I agree. I mean, they were in Joe Lunardi's first 4 out yesterday. Like post UCLA loss. And I'm just like, if they beat Purdue, if they win at Oregon, if they the game at Ohio State, like if they win 2 out of those 3, along with the 2 that you would expect that they would win, Penn State, who I think has just given up on basketball at this point.
Yeah.
The game at Washington, I think Washington has been a little feistier, but I'm not asking for IU to be in the NCAA tournament because, again, I'm kind of in the boat with everybody else who's like, can we please just get the season over with because it just kind of has gone nowhere. You're 15-11, but you win 9 games in the conference, and I think you've got a decent chance of being at the end of the bubble, because the bubble is not very good. The bubble is not a particularly strong bubble. So I just would caution everybody who's like, well, hey, no more tournament. I think at the very least, this team will have the opportunity, maybe even the mandated opportunity, to be in the NIT, because if they're one of the first 4 out, they're one of the top 4 seeds in the NIT at that point. It would be interesting. Like we've seen schools opt out of that, but I do wonder if that happens here or not. I'll be curious to see how IU decides to handle that. It would be an interesting scenario both directions.
Isn't this year also the Big Crown tournament at the end of the season, or is that next year? That's 2025.
I've lost track. I think you're right. It is this time. Yes.
So, and that's also a Big Ten Fox Sports connection. So, I mean, I take it back, because if they don't make the NIT, they'll be in the Big Crown or whatever the hell it is. Or, I mean, they'll at least get an invite. Or that's an invite I don't think you can turn down. I don't think you can tell Daddy. Like, you can tell Fox, like, hey, we're not going to provide content for you. Like, that's, I mean, that's
like, after all we did for you people. Yeah, no, it's
like you have these situations where it's like teams are done and we just want to be done and go to our coach search.
Yeah.
It's like Fox is like, we don't give an S. Like, we need content for you to play and go get your butt kicked in the Big Crown. So yeah, the Big Crown launches this year.
That's that's not ideal. But the college basketball crown, it launches 2 automatic qualifiers from each of the Big East, Big Ten, and Big 12, as well as 10 at-large teams will be selected from the pool of teams that did not qualify for the NCAA tournament. According to the Wikipedia page, they still hadn't announced what the criteria were. So,
hold on, I'm right now Googling college basketball crown bracketology.
Yeah, I haven't seen any brackets pop up on this yet. It's a little bit surprising.
There's not a bracketologist for, like, we've always joked, like, when you go to NIT bracketology, it's like I feel like I'm in the dark web. This is like a level below where it's like, oh, like I could buy Iranian arms and get the projection of the college basketball crown.
I will note that Todd Golden, not the Florida coach, but the writer for Indiana Hoosiers SI, wrote an article about this about a week and a half ago, and IU is the team that's pictured in the thing. So I think we're getting more basketball. I do wonder at this point, though, and this kind of transitions to something else I wanted to talk about. Does Indiana want to be in this? We know, of course, Indiana turned down the NIT last year. They weren't going to be a number 1 seed in the NIT, so I think that was part of the equation. There was an original comment that contractually the Big Ten teams, along with the other 2 conferences, would be required contractually to be in this thing. So if Indiana ends up in this, is Mike Woodson still coaching the team? Or do they make a change there? The whole thing is very weird. And I do think we need to comment on the fact that you've now seen 2 games in a row where Mike Woodson has not done radio with Don Fisher. He sent Calvert Chaney prior to the Michigan State game. They sent another staff member, not a coach, but like a support staff member, on the pregame radio on Friday for the UCLA game. Now, I've got a lot of thoughts on that. I don't think we need to necessarily delve into now. I do think it's kind of ridiculous that
it's lame. I mean, I don't want to dig into it either, but it's lame. And for a guy who's been a professional coach his entire career, who's coached in New York and dealt with media, this is just petty. And I get it. Like, this is your university, and you're pissed because you feel like you should be being treated better. That's fine. But go do your interviews. I mean, I've always joked, we know Don Fisher, like, it's an Indiana pregame interview. He's not going to ask you hard-hitting questions. Not going to be like, well, Mike, you really have sucked the last couple of weeks. It's going to be, hey, Mike, you guys are really turning the corner, after that loss to Michigan. I mean, he's going to throw softballs to you. To me, it's lame. It's weak. And for all the crap you give, college kids, 19, 20-year-olds for, the way they handle things sometimes, to me, this is really piss poor. To me, it's a really bad reflection. It's like, dude, man up and do your job. And this is not hard-hitting interviews. This is Don Fisher before the game.
Well, and I guess what bothers me, on top of everything you just said, because I think it's accurate, is that he is required to go do the post-game interview, the press conference, which he did. So it's like, the idea that you're drawing lines there and you're not doing, what you're normally obligated to do with your own radio is pretty lame. And it's also, I don't know, I've been very, not overly critical, but I think we've been consistently critical of Woodson when he's gone in and his message has essentially been, well, it's not really my fault, and he did that again in this UCLA game. He had a quote because someone asked about like his upperclassmen not getting the job done in crunch time. And, he made some set of comments about like all the winnable games they've had. And then he had a quote at the end there, which is like, I'll take responsibility as the coach, even though I don't miss a shot or miss a defensive assignment. And it's like that. We talked about this on the show a couple of weeks ago. And it's just like, this is part of the problem. Right. Is there's just a lack of accountability. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Scott. Like, this is part of your professional responsibilities. And you can be sore about the circumstances of things, but it's just the whole thing has been dealt with in an unprofessional manner by Woodson. And the way that he's handled these post-game press conferences has kind of fit right into that same thing. And now not doing, pre and post-game radio, it's part of the same thing. It looks petty, as you said, but it just kind of, it doesn't have that sense of like, there's a certain level of gravitas that goes with being the college basketball coach at Indiana University. Like you need to conduct yourself that way. And I feel like, as much as there's been controversy and back and forth about Woodson's comments during senior day last year, they fit right into this pattern. And, when you think about the totality of Woodson's comments over time, his public comments and the way that he's handled these things, and now to essentially be skipping out on obligations where you're supposed to talk to the fans, it's really disappointing, because from the standpoint of what was supposed to be a guy who understood IU basketball and understood like the positioning of that within the larger constellation of college basketball, this is yet another set of circumstances where you're like, you're acting like you're above this position, like somehow those rules don't apply to you. And you brought up a good point earlier where you said we would criticize players who acted petty or acted self-centered with all of these things. Woodson largely seems to be escaping that level of criticism, at least among like the people that are regularly covering the team, which is an interesting thing to watch. Everybody's given him this pad. No one's asking him questions about the circumstance. And all of it seems to center around, well, we want Mike Woodson to leave with some dignity. And yet there's not a lot of that intrinsic dignity that's being conducted in the way that he's handling some of these things, including some of the comments he's making in the post-game press conferences. It's just disappointing to watch.
No, it is. And the thing that you talked about, like, bringing back an IU coach, bringing back an IU player who has ties, and again, this is, I'm going to echo something you said, which is true. Like, most coaches just turn on, you think you called it auto speak, which I love that term. Like, they just go into auto speak mode. Man, we got, really got to work on that defense, and shots just aren't falling, and it's tough on the road. They say cliches over and over again, which is fine. But you would expect, for all this talk of, we're bringing back a guy who understands Indiana and understands that, this, you would think there would kind of be just a couple of moments of like this, like, I'm really broken up. Like, I can't believe this. This is killing me. I can't believe it. That's always been, and I don't want to turn into a bitch on Woodson session, but it's like, that's always been, I think, the thing that has held fans at a bit of an arm's length is we love this program and we care about it. And some people go to extreme lengths, both monetarily and time-wise, for this program. And it always felt like Woodson was kind of doing this as a coronation, and like, I don't have to do that much, and we can get by, and what's the minimum amount required to do. And I think that starts to build up some resentment. And this is exactly one of those things where I think IU fans would just kind of like to hear the coach, who's a former player, be on there and be like, this sucks. Like, this really sucks. Like, I like to win. I'm used to winning. Like, this absolutely sucks. This is gutting me. I was up all night. Whether it's even true, I think they would just like to hear it. And then just to be pissed, just not even do it. It feels very as if he's not as invested as the fans at times, which I know is not the case. But it's like, I'm having a hard time finding evidence to say that isn't true. So we can get all, we don't need to belabor the point, but it's like, it is it's really a bummer. And it's for those people who, the last thing I'll say is this is again why it's really frustrating on the outside for people nationally, just to hear some of those voices being like, man, Indiana fans, like they want too much. It's like, there's a lot of little nuances here that really do matter. And for people who spend a lot of time and effort following a program and investing in a program, those little nuances matter. And so that's where you do get pissed at the national media, just being like, oh, what do you guys expect? Like you're past your prime. Like you should be happy you have Woodson.
Yeah, well, I don't know that anybody's said specifically that recently, but your point is well taken. Well, let's pivot to talk about that a little bit. So, there's 5 regular season games left for IU, and then you've got at least one game in the Big Ten tournament because, as you noted, IU is going to make the Big Ten tournament as things are set now. Penn State losing again yesterday, so now you've got Northwestern, Washington, and Penn State all with 4 wins, and 3 wins. Minnesota with 5, Rutgers with 5, Iowa with 5, and then Indiana's got 6. So the chances of Indiana losing out and one of those remaining teams winning to the point where they would eclipse IU seem low at this stage. And so you're looking at IU playing in the first round of the Big Ten tournament. Seeding is hard to say because Indiana's got some tiebreakers in this mix. They lose the tiebreaker to Nebraska. They lose a tiebreaker to Iowa, but they have the tiebreaker against USC. If they beat Oregon, they'd have the tiebreaker against Oregon. So they could really be seeded kind of anywhere between probably 9th and 15th.
Do you like the fact that teams don't make the Big Ten tournament? Like, I understand it logistically. This conference is so big, but I again, this is old man get off my lawn. I think you're losing something every time you pull a thread away. That I used to joke that the NCAA tournament really is everyone is in the tournament. It's just you have small bracket tournaments. And the Big Ten is its own like qualifying tournament. But, theoretically, it's a 312 team tournament. It's just broken up a bunch of different brackets that meets at 68. You've now lost that. Like there's 3 teams in the Big Ten that can't make it. Again, I don't think Penn State was going to make a run to the Final Four. But it's just I just want to say here, I don't like it. But that's all. But I understand logistically you have to do it. I don't like it.
I mean, I don't particularly care of one way or the other about who's in the Big Ten tournament once you get past like the top 10 teams in the conference. And so there's a lot of bad basketball that gets played during the Big Ten tournament just because of the way that it's set up. And I mean, do we really want to watch Penn State one more time? I understand the idea that, well, you got to let everybody in or not, but a lot of smaller conferences have changed their approach on this because the more you make your top teams play during this time period, the more chances they have to lose. And I don't know that we necessarily need that at the conference tournament level because there's just not a good, like most of these conference tournaments were invented or created or conceived at a time when you had 8, 9, 10, 11 teams per conference. They weren't built for 15, 16, 17, 18 team conferences. And, I would feel bad if it was like a small conference, but only to a certain point. With the large conferences, like you have 20 games in which to demonstrate your worth. If you can't win more than 4 or 5 of those 20 games, like that's not a scheduling error. That's just you being a bad basketball team. So no, I have no qualms with it whatsoever. And I'm a guy who, as you all know, supports expanding the NCAA tournament field in terms of the total number of teams. So it's not like I have a problem with teams, with tournaments being larger, but I don't really see a great argument for letting the bottom 3 teams into the Big Ten tournament any more than I would see it in the SEC or some of the other conferences that are this size.
It's a fair point. And I guess, like my thought goes to the year, like Illinois was the worst team in the Big Ten and made it to the finals. But like they were the 11th team, whereas Penn State is now the 18th team.
Right. That's the thing.
The dregs are getting more draggier. So anyway, go ahead.
That's kind of my point. It's like, I think you could make an argument with the 10, 9, 10, 11 team conferences. Yeah, let everybody in. And that was easy to do. But like, what are you going to have 6 days of conference tournament? That seems kind of pointless, really. Like you lose people's attention by that stage.
Well, because they're also student athletes.
Yeah, well, you can bring the tutors with you. Right. So anyway, so we've got that much time left in the season. And, from the standpoint of what to watch for moving forward, I just don't know with Indiana what do you get excited about there's normally here it'd be like, all right, well, let's see how the younger players are playing. Let's not that a lot of them are getting a lot of minutes at this point, but you could see like, well, maybe your backcourt duo that you brought in the transfer portal can continue to gain chemistry. And then you look at them as like, well, they haven't played together hardly at all, with Rice being increasingly unreliable and Carlisle being injured. And I think playing for the first time in a couple of weeks in that UCLA game. Bryson Tucker's been spotty at best. And then the rest of the guys, even the guys I just mentioned, with a looming coaching change, you don't know if those guys are even going to be back. So it is a real tough spot, because I don't even know that IU fans have a clear sense of what to be watching for.
No, I mean, because that is the other side reality of the new NIL world is, and I'm using names of players I obviously know nothing, but like, 10 years ago, it'd be like, all right, well, Mackenzie Mbaka, we've seen him grow up. Can he take another leap? You've seen Renew turn into a solid, great post player. How can he look when he's healthy all year? But I would assume both those guys are in the portal. Like they might come back, but I would if they're doing their due diligence, they probably should at least put their name in the portal with a coaching change and see what they can get. They might come back, but I mean, I would expect everyone to go into the portal. And like you said, our backcourt, maybe it's Miles Rice and Carlisle, but they haven't played together. And Miles Rice, like, why would he not at least test his options? So I mean, that is a trouble you have, and you're hitting it perfectly. It's like, I don't know what there is to grab onto, because that is that was what college basketball, like the NBA has, you can tank and you can look for draft picks. College basketball had, all right, let's look at our young freshmen and sophomores and who's going to grow. And that has been ripped out of college basketball, because now they're all going to be in the portal, as they should be given the circumstances.
Yeah, no, and it's less about like that, because you're right. I mean, players need to do what they need to do. It's more just like I think if Indiana wins the UCLA game, they're 7-8 and 16-10, and you can make an argument like, well, hey, you're still in this. And even though I just said like they're going to be on the fringes of it, you lose that game the way that you lost the Michigan game, the way you lost the Maryland game, the way you lost the Purdue game, essentially. And it's like, I don't even feel like we're making progress towards what could be considered a satisfactory end of the season.
That's what's wild about this team is like, when you go back and look at it, they're not losing. They're losing a lot of close games. They're just finding different ways to lose close games. I mean, they won Michigan State. They won at Ohio State. So they've had a couple, but that's kind of law of averages. I mean, really, they've lost more of these close games. There's been a lot of close game losses.
Well, and this is where, if you remember earlier on in the season, Indiana's luck rating on KenPom, which again, just a quick reminder, is the how much better or worse your record is based upon what it should be statistically. Indiana was in like the 60s in luck, I think, about a month and a half ago. They've dropped to 149. Which is how luck should work. Like eventually that regresses to the mean. So you can kind of say, well, it's not that Indiana's losing close games surprisingly at this point. It's that they probably should have lost games earlier, and the record is finally starting to show how they've been playing.
If you buy 100 scratch-offs and you win the first 5, you're probably not going to continue winning.
Right. So anyway, this will be a challenge, I think, for the diehards that are trying to keep their focus on this season and this team. And look, again, I think Indiana's going to win at least a couple more games, probably against teams that you wouldn't expect them to. And yet, I just don't think anybody is going to get real excited. Even after that Michigan State game, it wasn't like people went nuts and were like, hey, things are turning around in the right direction. It was like, oh, that's interesting. Indiana beat Michigan State. So that's kind of where we're at with all of that.
The Big Ten tournament this year is in Cambridge. It's in Indy, right?
Correct. That's right.
Okay.
You going to go?
I might. Honestly, it depends on who we play. I might go just for kind of what's it going to be like. Like not going assuming we're going to win, but I mean that in a weird way, the Big Ten tournament has had some moments where Archie's team gets booed off the court. It'd be curious to see how the fans react, because that's almost more of forgive the political reference here, but like the Assembly Hall is almost like the Democratic National Committee. Like it's the insiders of basketball. Like once you get to Cambridge, it's more the popular vote. Like that is a lot more, party outside. It's people who are just coming in. And I could see a lot more angst at Cambridge, because those are just fans who are not as invested and not willing to be like, all right, let's not boo our home team on the home court. Like it's just kind of your average fan coming out and be like, this sucks. Boo! You guys suck. Like, get out of here. So it could be, I might go. It might just be interesting to see.
That's it. Yeah. Let's pivot. I might go too, so I might see you there. We'll see.
But I'm with you. I have no idea who we could play. Like, I don't even know what seed plays.
I mean,
There's 4 buys. Like, the top teams get a quad buy.
Yeah. I saw a projection yesterday where Indiana plays Iowa in the 12-13 game, which feeds into playing UCLA as the 5 seed, which then would feed into playing Maryland as the 4 seed, which, as tournament pathways go, that's not that bad. Although that has Iowa hitting like 28 threes in the first game written all over it.
Yeah.
So, we feel like we've been down that road before, but we'll see what happens. The weird thing is we have no games to talk about this upcoming week. Indiana's got a 9-day break, which means we have to talk coaching search stuff. So we are going to talk coaching search stuff kind of in the macro, but there were some things that came up in one of the more recent podcasts that I did with Tony Adrania that caught your attention about,
which was an awesome pod.
Okay, that was fine. Yeah, no, Tony does a great job as always. Yeah. But we talked a little bit about like kind of IU's place within the larger landscape and whether it's a good job or whether it's been a bad job for a while or whether it's just been bad hiring decisions. But you had heard some things in there that you wanted to bring up. So let me have you start off by kind of giving your perspective on things.
Yeah, no, it was a great pod, as I said. I was thinking about how, it kind of keyed into the 87 to 94 stretch, which obviously I know we didn't have a coaching change. I'm not losing cognitively that bad yet. But it was like, I kind of called you and was like, that was, in my mind, kind of a seismic change in college basketball, that you went from kind of this era of, hey, you're from the Midwest, you go to Indiana, or you're from the West, you go to UCLA. Like, recruiting was very regional. Recruiting became a thing, with the Fab Five, and a little bit of UNLV too. UNLV was a team that I think they lost their luster with the Fab Five, but you had recruiting. AAU stepped in, shoe contracts became a big thing, and that just wasn't what IU was doing. I joke with people all the time. I lived through that era. We were a Converse school. I swear we were like LA Gear one year. We just did not have good shoe contracts. We didn't have those relationships, and it felt like Indiana as a whole kind of just missed that window for a couple of years. And then it feels like we've been trying to get back ever since. And my thought was that it does feel like you're having a seismic change now in college basketball with NIL and, all the things that are happening. And it feels like we are way more well-positioned this time, and we understand the landscape changing. And I can see other programs like maybe Michigan or other teams they're not doing as good of a job. So that was kind of the overarching thought that I had as you guys were kind of going through the historical thought is, it feels like we've been playing catch up for 25, 30 years from kind of missing that last seismic change.
Well, and, my perspective on it is that there have been a couple of key changes in terms of how the college basketball landscape and the sports landscape in general has happened. One of them was you hit the nail on the head, like mid to late 80s. There was a change in how talent got funneled to teams, and it switched from being a high school centric thing to an AAU centric thing. Shoe companies started to get involved because they looked at the long-term ramifications of being able to essentially lock in talent from an early age and then profit when they made the big time. And they looked at the colleges as an important conduit on the way through. And it's interesting because even though IU really didn't participate in that to the same degree that like Michigan did during that time period, or Duke or Kansas or Kentucky, it didn't hurt IU necessarily because Knight was a good enough coach that he could still pull in top level talent when he wanted to. And, to me, like it fit in with a lot of the rules changes that started to make college basketball more similar to professional basketball. The institution of the 3-point line, the institution of the shot clock, the reduction of the shot clock from 45 seconds to 35 seconds, some other smaller rules involved in all of that. And just this idea that college basketball became less regional and became more national. IU was still relevant in that era, but and even, obviously IU had their last great gasp under Knight in that 91 to 93 range, but that was almost in spite of those currents. And in the mid 90s, as you saw top level talent clearly being funneled to the Kentuckys, the Dukes, the North Carolinas, Indiana, even though they were getting what was on paper highly rated talent, it didn't match what needed to happen at Indiana in terms of winning basketball games, and we've obviously mined that quite a bit historically on the podcast. But it also meant that, IU looked like they were under Knight kind of standing against the grain. That was changing, and this is something that I always remind people of. Like, Knight, I think, realized too late at the end that they needed to modernize the way that they were doing things, and they started to modernize. To the point that IU signed that Nike contract that put them under Nike's brand for a few years. That was a Knight initiative. Like, that wasn't something that IU did, against his wishes. It just that he wasn't around to see that take place. And I remember that being such a big deal when you were and I were in school.
Yeah.
Like, it was a point of pride that, Michigan's using a company that uses sweatshops in Asia, but Indiana isn't. And then Indiana was like, no, we need to do that too. And
then suddenly we were like, yeah, it sounds great.
but it led into the next era break where Indiana did not keep pace. And it was immediately after Bob Knight got fired.
Can I pause there for 1 second? Just I know we've hit on this before too, but with the Knight kind of changing to Nike, it's like I will always still go down that you look at that 01-02 team. And this is something you've also talked about too. Knight went through ebbs and flows of kind of being interested in recruiting and really going at it. And it felt like, unfortunately, when we were in college, he was in kind of an ebb of just, like, sure, Wrecker, come on in. And like, Wrecker, get out. Like, just all of it, just not really going that hard at it. But you look at the complexion of that 01-02 team. It's like you have a bona fide star in Jared Jeffries. You have kind of a really interesting big man in George Leach. You have the defender in Dane Fife. You have, Scott May Jr., I'm just going through the list, but like you have the shooter and Kyle Horns. Like you have Jared Odell is like a perfect Knight player. I'm 90% sure Kirk Hastings would have stayed another year if Knight was there. And then you had Sean May, who would have come in had Knight still been there. Like, Knight was coalescing kind of his one last run. Like, I think he was like, all right, I'm gonna really focus and put this together. And you look at it, and that, I think this is also something you had mentioned on the pod, that like that 01-02 team is kind of thought of as like, man, Davis really took this ragtag bunch to the Final Four. It's like, that team was really effing talented. Like, he might have underperformed with that team when you look at the full season. So sorry, I just wanted to point that out. But like, it's like Knight was making one last push, and then, but it obviously didn't happen.
One detail note: Sean May wouldn't have started playing till the 02-03 season.
Like you're rolling out of a really good team that maybe Jeffrey. Now I'm playing a little hypothetically. Maybe Jeffrey stays one more year, probably not. But like he has the engine running, which probably would have turned into Pat Knight's now the coach. So that's a whole different third world.
Who knows on that front? I mean, anything's possible there. But I think the larger point is that there had been a course correction. But then the next change happened in college basketball, which was really what hit all of college sports, which was this kind of professionalization of the top programs. And IU was caught flat-footed because IU athletics was being used as a pawn by an administrator at that point to try to raise his standing within the academic world. And unfortunately, IU, I think, is still playing catch-up to some degree. You've seen finally with football, like they finally got the resources up to where they're competing amongst the nationals, but the mentality of basketball never really changed. And, there's still a lot of people who cling to the values and the morals of the previous era, not really understanding that those weren't the things that made IU basketball successful. What made them successful was having the top coach in college basketball for 20 plus years. You end up in an era where, Indiana, in terms of a bunch of things, but primarily reputation and connection, has really struggled to garner the type of talent that other schools have garnered over the course of time. And a lot of that's been the coaches that they've hired. But it was also how long it took Indiana to put Assembly Hall in a format that looked modern.
Yeah.
It took until 2015 or 2016, whatever that renovation started, for the place to kind of start looking like a modern basketball arena. There's just a lot of little things with the athletic department in general that the seeds for most of that change elsewhere got planted in the 2000 to 2005 range. Indiana was just essentially at war with itself internally and 10 years late with things. And so it does, from the standpoint of resources, like you can't argue that IU doesn't throw a ton of resources at its basketball program, but it's really like in service of what? And this is where I think Indiana's really got some soul searching to do in terms of who they're going to hire as their next basketball coach. Because for as much as I agree that this is still a really good job, and that a lot of what Indiana's struggles have been in terms of like they've hired the wrong coaches, there is a certain like fabric of the program that just has kind of disintegrated. And when we go back and talk about the apathy of the fans and the level of which people have turned off, the way that the coaches have managed the programs, and just the fact that Assembly Hall is not that tough of a place to come in and win at anymore, at least not compared to what it used to be, in terms of the recruiting failures that Indiana's had and the lack of effort in going after recruiting, you're really gonna have to get the right person to come in and reestablish the culture of Indiana basketball, because there really isn't one at this point. And I think that's probably the biggest disappointment, is like if you look at most of these programs that are out there, they're either programs that have maintained culture over the course of a long period of time, or they're programs that have hired people that have come in and done quick fixes, kind of like Curt Cignetti did with IU football, where it's like he imported the culture, that became the culture. IU's going to have to realize, and I think its fans are going to have to realize, that that's the kind of transplant that's going to have to happen, because it has to be, you have to attach that to a coach, much as you did with Bob Knight when he came in 1971. Like that was a huge culture change that happened in a short period of time. And the last, this to tie it back into the Tony podcast that we did, IU has to realize that it's a great job, but the job itself isn't a guarantee that your basketball team is going to be great, that you have to hire the right people, and that those people have to be able to create a culture and a foundation that can stand on its own, that ties to the IU brand. There's nothing intrinsic in the IU brand that guarantees you're going to have those things.
Agreed. I where I'm positive is when you look at those other seismic changes, the culture of the program was important. In that, in the 90s, you needed to have those connections to AAU. You had to have the shoe contracts. We really didn't. In the 2000s, you had to have the facilities and the understanding of you're turning into a modern program, and it feel like we didn't. This time, this seismic change feels like the key component is, do you have the NIL and do you have the money? And it does feel like we have those things. And I've had multiple conversations with people about how, like, I don't know how much facilities matter anymore, to a point. Obviously, you need to have some level of facility, which we do. But the idea of, in that mid 2000s, like, oh, everyone gets a hot tub and we have a PS2 in the locker room. It's like, I don't think that matters. It's more like, all right, it's awesome. You have a court, you have a training facility. What's my NIL money? Like, it comes down to money real quick. And I think the fact that, I think you are right with like culture. From a team perspective, like the groups inside the locker room, there has to be a culture and an understanding of what this team is and what Indiana basketball is. But kind of the university culture, I think, is less important, and more important is what the dollar amounts are. And I do think that's a spot where Indiana is well positioned. The money is there, because you look at a year like this year, they brought a lot of money and a lot of talent to the table. There wasn't a culture in the locker room to kind of put that into a system. I don't think it's a culture of the university. Whereas I would say the last two times, the culture of the university mattered, because it kind of mattered who, as a program, like who are you connected with on a shoe contract, and like what does your university stand for in those kinds of things. So that's how I look at it positively. That I do think we're well positioned this time, because we've shown we have the money, we have that those connections, the NIL level. We just now need the kind of the culture ported to the locker room, which is exactly what Cignetti did. He ported a culture to the locker room, not really in, Memorial Stadium at large.
Well, I think this is where it's worth bringing up something I believe I brought up in the last coaching search, which is, when I look at the hot boards, when I look at the stated desires of a lot of IU fans, like they're insistent that you have to hire a top coach right now from another program, that Indiana's got to stop playing around, that they need to throw serious money at somebody who's having success right now. And I get that perspective to some degree, and sometimes I dabble in that myself. But I do think it's worth noting, like, let's take the KenPom top 30, and let's kind of go through and look at the coaches that were hired in each of these places and where they came from. And then let's think about what Indiana's actually angling for. Like, so what do you want if you're IU, if you're an IU fan? I'm assuming you want IU to be a successful championship contending team. I'm assuming that you want Indiana to be winning conference titles or at least competing for them. I'm assuming you want IU to be, going deep into the NCAA tournament, competing for top recruits, getting top recruits, all of that. So,
and a coach who does the pregame interviews.
And a coach who does the pregame interviews. So, but I would note, like, go down the list of the top teams and let's look at where their coaches came from. So I'm just going straight off the Saturday, February 15th update for KenPom. So you got Bruce Pearl with Auburn, and they are clearly the best team in the country right now. And I'll note, like, Bruce Pearl, when he was at Tennessee, he made the tournament all 6 years. He got hired there from Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he'd had a successful 4-year tenure. He, of course, gets busted for violating recruiting rules at Tennessee, gets a show cause put on him, is gone for 4 years, and then gets hired at Auburn. And his first 3 years at Auburn, they didn't make the NCAA tournament. Who is second right now? It's Duke.
Right.
Who's their coach? It's John Shire. Was John Shire a head coach anywhere before he took over Duke? No, he was a career assistant basically with Mike Krzyzewski.
It's a bad example and none of our assistants, I think, can coach. But go ahead.
Houston is coached by Kelvin Sampson, who we know him very, very clearly, and he was on a show cause penalty and got hired out of oblivion by Houston after sitting on an NBA bench for a few years. Todd Golden, the head coach at Florida. Where was Todd Golden? Was he a top? This is a guy who's got his team in the top 5 of the NCAA. They're 4th in KenPom right now. Was this a top level coach somewhere else? No. Todd Golden coached 3 years at San Francisco. Did a great job. His 3rd year, they end up in the first round of the NCAA tournament as a 10 seed, and that's an accomplishment at San Francisco, who hasn't had a lot of success. Gets hired from Florida, and now has that team in a really good spot. Rick Barnes is a coach that IU fans have looked down their nose at for decades. This is a guy who had a very successful run at Texas. If IU had hired Rick Barnes in, say, 2017, people would have flipped out. I don't necessarily want Rick Barnes as my coach, but that's the 5th ranked team in KenPom right now, and that's a guy who took his team to the Elite 8 last year, the Sweet 16 the year before. Let's keep going down the list.
Let me do one. Nate Oates.
Nate Oates.
So imagine after Archie, you hire Nate Oates, who's coming off of 4 good years at Buffalo, but 1 year it didn't win 20 games and also never made it to the Sweet 16 at Buffalo.
So you hire a guy from Buffalo, a MAC school, to go coach there, and I mean, he's clearly done very well. Grant McCasland at Texas Tech. This is a guy that was at North Texas for 6 years and got taken, and it was very successful. Like, his last 2 years at North Texas was 25-7 and 31-7. But the number of people who I've seen now say, IU can't get a mid-major coach. They have to go big time. Iowa State, TJ Otzelberger. This is a guy who was an assistant at Iowa State, went and coached at South Dakota State, had a successful run at South Dakota State, but that's a really good program. Had 2 years at UNLV in the middle of COVID where they didn't really do anything. Got hired after going 12-15 to come back to Iowa State to be the head coach, and has been a revelation. I mean, he's 2 Sweet 16s in 3 years and a top 10 team so far this season. Greg Gard at Wisconsin replaces Bo Ryan after Bo Ryan steps away, had never been a head coach at the Division I level. Matt Painter, we've already covered, had been a head coach for 1 season and, gets hired at Purdue in his early 30s. Mark Few had been a career assistant at Gonzaga. Tommy Lloyd had been a career assistant at Gonzaga before he got hired at Arizona. Buzz Williams has bounced all over the place. And had
I think your point. I mean,
I'm not going to go through all of them, but my point ultimately is, as you go down the list of most of the coaches who have the top 20 teams in KenPom, Dennis Gates at Mizzou, they just had a big win at Georgia last night. He was at Cleveland State for 3 years. So my point is,
the only one that I think would meet the criteria of what IU fans want would be Pitino and St. John's, which it works, but.
Or the 15th ranked team KenPom, which is Bill Self in Kansas.
Correct.
But
Kansas has an identity and has an ethos.
Right. Well, also there's a thread on the college basketball subreddit about whether Bill Self's done. Like, is he cooked? Has he reached his peak and receding now since he had his heart condition a couple of years ago? Like, so my point is this. I have said, this is me kind of speaking out of both sides of my mouth, admittedly, where it's like, well, IU needs to try to grab a top level coach and bring them in, because you can't afford to miss on this coaching hire for all the reasons that we laid out in the last podcast and for some of the reasons we talked about earlier in this one. But if you look at the pattern, going and getting a top coach from another program and bringing them in is just not something that happens that much. I mean, you don't see. I mean, Tennessee, yes, they hired Rick Barnes, but Rick Barnes was done at Texas. Like, his time was over. There aren't that many excited Texas or just Tennessee basketball fans, but I'm sure like all those people wanted to hire Bruce Pearl again. They didn't want to hire Rick Barnes. It's worked out for both parties. But the point is, ultimately, it is very rare to go and find a program that is going to just import success at the top level. You have a better chance in many cases of finding someone that you really believe is going to take your team to the next level. IU got burned with that. Like, that was what the Archie Miller hire was supposed to be. It didn't end up working out that way. But this idea that you can only hire a top coach at another program is not necessarily the sole answer. And I think the problem right now is that IU fans have been convinced, either by their own recognizance or by the words of people that cover the program, that IU needs to swing for the fences. I think a lot of IU fans will stop there and will not be particularly patient or particularly excited, might even just be very angry about hiring somebody from the lower tier. I'm not so much worried about the fan reaction there, Scott, but I do think the donor reaction is going to be weird, because I think most donors were like, all right, we're going to move on from Woodson. We cannot afford to miss on this. Let's go get the very best there is. Let's spend that money. It's just not something that happens regularly out there. And most of the successful teams that we're seeing right now in this business are not hiring that way. So I am really curious to see what direction Indiana goes with this, because a lot of what IU fans seem to want at this stage doesn't really jibe with the reality of how hiring happens elsewhere.
No, it's a fair point. I mean, you look at, we keep saying this, you look at Memorial Stadium as a guide. Signetti was the perfect hire. And you look at his track record, it's like, this guy wins at every level. He's had head coaching experience, but Indiana also was kind of lucky in that we were looking for a coach at that time, but also that we were willing to take it. We as a program could take a chance on somebody like that, and you weren't going to get pushback. Like Auburn, I don't even know if they were looking for a coach last year, but like a program like Auburn wasn't going to hire Signetti. And I think that's unfortunately where Indiana basketball is right now. Is it has this feeling of like, we're better than that, but in reality you need to go out and get the best coach. And my hope is that because Dolson was the one who went through that Signetti process, he's able to look at this as like, all right, let's take the Indiana exceptionalism to the side, so to speak, and let's just be a program looking for a coach. And if we take all of those things aside, I'm sure there's a lot of programs in college football that are like, damn it. And I was trying to pull up real quick, like, who else was looking for coaches in last offseason in college football. But I'm sure there's programs that are a notch above Indiana. They're like, damn it. We should have just put our ego aside and hired the best coach that's out there. And to your point, like, there's an alchemy here that's tough to know. It's like sometimes guys like Signetti have those backgrounds. Like Archie had a similar type background of winning and it didn't work out. And so you're not always it's not a perfect answer every time. But I agree that sometimes programs put themselves in these thoughts where it's like, we can't hire the best guy. We have to hire the guy that looks the best for this program.
Well,
I really hope that I'm with you in agreement. I hope we don't do
that. The struggle is oftentimes it's part of what you said. Yes. It's also, I think, an issue of, well, who's deciding what the criteria are. And I think it's, to some degree, is how you end up with Mike Woodson as the head coach last time around. But
sometimes the donors do make that criteria because they're the ones paying the buyouts and they're the ones paying the contracts.
Yeah, because there's a perceptional issue where if you go get a big name, people will be like, "Oh, I'll spend money on that." If you go get like the up and coming coach that could be the next any one of those names that we mentioned, it'd be like, "Why are we wasting our time and money hiring this person?"
Yeah.
And you've already spent a round, of ammunition on Archie Miller with that process. Do you get to have that same luxury again if that's indeed the right hire? To go back to your question about like what were the hires happening in the last cycle, it was obviously Kalen DeBoer gets hired at Alabama in football. Willie Fritz was viewed as like a top hire. He goes from Tulane to Houston. Yeah. Mike Elko gets hired at Texas A&M. They basically spent a bunch of money to have the exact same outcome. Jonathan Smith was viewed as a better hire than Cignetti was. Well, that didn't work out particularly well. And then you go down Jed Fish at Washington from Arizona. That didn't. I mean, it kind of worked, but not to the degree that you might expect. I think you can make it hard.
I don't think Washington would have hired Cignetti. It would have looked like, what are we doing?
Yeah. So you take all of that and you look at this and you say to yourself, well, there's the reality of what's happening in college basketball with the hires, and then there's the perception of what needs to happen if it's IU. And this is where you get into some trouble. And it's where a lot of the names that you're seeing floating around. I mean, would it be great to get a Brad Stevens or
we put that to bed? Like, I wanted to hit that real quick. Like, again, it came up again. I saw you in the Discord be like, all right, like I've been making the same joke. I'm not going down this rabbit hole. Like I'm not going to do it. Like you can talk yourself blue in the face about I know this and his kids doing this. Like it's not going to happen. It is funny that we had to have the rodeo, the 3-day Stevens rodeo again, where it's like it's not going to happen. And it's like, oh, maybe it is. Like I'm hearing rumors. Like I have a friend who knows a friend. Then it's like, oh no, he's not. It's like it's not going to happen. Like no problem asking. Like that's probably the first call you need to make for the next 12 years. Make the call, but let's all know it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe anything until a hire is made one way or the other on things. But again, it's just like the one thing I'll say on the Stevens front is there was no reason for Stevens to make a statement. Stevens is not required to talk to the media. Stevens is not required to interact with the media. There's no requirement that an NBA GM.
What if Stevens starts doing Fisher's pregame hits?
Yeah, that would be quite a twist. Yeah.
It's like we've hired Stevens, ... to do the pregame interview for the rest of the year.
Not a bad idea. But it's like there was no reason. Like Brad Stevens wasn't getting hounded coming out of his house every day. Right. So why go through all the trouble of talking to a reporter and going on record as saying that you're happy in Boston? Like the number of IU fans who believe either that this is Jeff Goodman pushing something for his own agenda, which is, I mean, I'm sorry, it's ludicrous. Or people who believe, oh, well, this is just to throw everybody off the scent. It's like, what scent was needed to be thrown off? Like it was, like IU isn't going to answer questions on it, and Brad Stevens doesn't have to answer questions on it. It doesn't make any sense that you would go to all of that trouble and draw more attention to it. It doesn't, that does not compute to me. So, but again, like I said, people say all kinds of crazy things during coaching searches. I have decided in this one, we're going to go through the coaching candidates. We're going to talk through what they look like. We have a good podcast stored up that I'm recording a little later on in this week with a long-time occasional guest with Crimson Cast, where we'll go through some of the candidates in a unique way. But realistically speaking, that anything is possible. There's no such thing as a 0% chance. But I mean, put that to bed for now. Let's just talk about other candidates. And my point though was like, it would be great if IU got somebody of that caliber, but I don't think it's necessary that IU gets somebody of that caliber. And ultimately there are things that we don't necessarily know about how coaches are like playing within the landscape of IU. There's just a lot of factors at play, and it's not simply the records, and it's not simply the, oh, there's a great coach over there, we're just going to go grab that coach and bring them over here, because it's just not generally how it happens. And when it does happen, it happens very irregularly. Like Roy Williams didn't leave Kansas to go to North Carolina because North Carolina was a better job. He left because Dean Smith basically told him he had to come back because that was where he got his start. Roy Williams was broken up about leaving Kansas. And again, once you have a good thing at a decent program,
right,
and especially if you can win at the level that a Bruce Pearl or a Nate Oates is winning at Alabama or at Auburn, what advantage does Indiana have in the landscape with those types of coaches? Is it worth spending all that extra money when those same coaches would not have been hired based upon the same criteria that IU fans and some IU media are putting on this search? That's really ultimately what I want everybody to keep in mind. Anyway, we head off into the upcoming week here. IU, of course, not in action for men's basketball, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of weird discourse about the coaching searches coming up, and we will be talking about that as well here on the show, as we've got a bunch of different things to talk about. We've got a lot of different types of candidates that are out there, a lot of people expressing like their innate desire that it be this candidate or that candidate. So we'll dive into some of that throughout the course of this upcoming week.
We're still 2 to 3 weeks away from it even being a warm stove. I mean, you're still 1, 2, 3, like 5 weeks away from the NCAA tournament.
Yeah,
it's an odd. It's obviously still going on, but it feels like we're still a long way away from being a long way away.
Now, the tournament starts in 5 weeks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've got at least that long and probably longer if you're going after a coach that's in the NCAA tournament. So we'll see what happens with all of that. But anyway, that'll wrap it up for us here. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We will be back later on this week with more content, including a look at what's going on with the coaching search, some of the candidates and whatnot. Our thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Our thanks to our friends across the Back Home Network. And, of course, our thanks to you folks for tuning in. We will be back later. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.